switch this on when we start?
They'll switch it.
They do it. I remember that movie. There was this movie where the guy had it on and he went to the John first.
Sure. Good afternoon. My name is Harold Scott-Roth, and I'm happy to welcome you here to the Hudson Institute and the Center for the Economics of the Internet. We're very honored today to have, you can't hear, you turn the volume up a little bit. We're very honored today to have with us Irwin Stelzer, who is the head of the Center for Economic Policy here at the Hudson Institute. Let me just update you on a couple of upcoming events. We have Commissioner Noah Phillips of the Federal Trade Commission is going to be speaking here at Hudson on March 26th, I believe is the date, or the 27th, something like that. We also have a 5G program at the end of March as well. Then on April 30th, we have another event, and I will remember it in just a minute. We have on May 4th, we have Jonathan Baker, who's professor of law at American University. Will be speaking about his new book on antitrust. But first, let me introduce our today's speaker, who needs no introduction.
It helps.
Okay. Dr. Stelzer is one of the most eminent economists in the world. He was the co-founder of NERA, one of probably the first major economic consulting firm in America. He has been at the forefront of economic thinking for a little while now, and he could foresee the growth of both economics and antitrust at the time of the founding in the 1960s. He's been involved with new and innovative thinking in both the communications and media space and in the energy space. And today he's going to be speaking to us about antitrust policy for high tech. And we are all waiting with bated breath to hear.
Don't bait your breath too much.
Okay.
Thanks, Harold. That's a very kind introduction. I think my father would have loved it. My mother would have believed it. Can you guys hear me? All right. Let me begin by saying that I'm here under sort of false pretenses. It says in the invitation or the announcement that I'm Professor Stelzer. I want to say I am not now, nor have I ever been a professor. So please discount that. It's really nice to come here, partly because Harold, himself a distinguished public servant and anti-regulation regulator, has this series going. And one advantage of this forum is that I have the option of being wrong, in which case I correct myself. So anything you hear that doesn't sound plausible to you, please don't hesitate to bring up. Let me begin by saying there's one of the fangs I'm not going to spend any time on, and that's Netflix. I wouldn't want to put out of business the deliverers of pizzas and other things for those of you who binge on this stuff, I'm told. I certainly don't want to break up a Ponzi scheme where a company borrows money, loses it, and then goes and borrows still more on better terms because it's lost so much the first time buying its customers. I don't understand it, and so I won't talk about it. It's the fellow Fangsters that I want to talk about. And they present, I think, a range of extraordinarily difficult public policy problems, in part because we're schizophrenic. We want to retain the innovative drive that has brought so many products we've come to love or hate, but certainly that are important in the American economy. but we're uncomfortable with the power that they wield. And we're sort of fumbling around to try to figure out what to do about it. Now, fortunately, and this is really my central point, if you probably won't remember very much except lunch. So if you can only remember one point, it's that we already have in place the policy tools to handle the problems that these companies present. We don't need massive fines. We don't need new laws. We don't need new regulations. We need an intelligent interpretation of what's already on the books. You can tell that regulation doesn't frighten these people because if you listen to the Facebook bunch, they are calling for regulation. Now, those of us who've been around that racket for a very long time know that regulation is a terrific barrier to entry by newcomers. And so it's not surprising to find Mr. Zuckerberg saying, oh boy, we really need some regulation here. He knows that there's no possibility of any regulator keeping up with his ability to get out in front of that regulator, but that it creates a huge barrier for anyone who wants to compete because you need a very large expense to cope with regulators. So as far as I'm concerned, Facebook, Google, Amazon, and let me add Apple just for a little fun, present 4 policy problems that have us sort of thrashing around. The first is the absence of effective competition in many of these markets in which they operate. This applies to Facebook, to Google, less urgently to Amazon, but they all have the power, including Amazon, and I'll explain why, to decapitate competition when it rears its lovely head. The second is their unwillingness, and this is particularly Facebook, to control content. We have a big problem with that. They have very relaxed attitudes toward, and certainly Facebook does, towards its obligation to prevent the use of its platform, of its social media platform, Google too, to spread false, dangerous, inciting, and other kinds of materials that would land any print publisher in jail. Now I'm using Facebook as the poster boy, and I'll briefly touch on the others, but Facebook is such a handy poster boy for this that I will use it. The third problem is their unwillingness to prevent the spread and misuse of private information. This is made available to them by users of their services, and they certainly do not want to prevent the spread of this information because that's what they're selling. I mean, that would be like saying, you know, I'll regulate General Motors, I'll regulate myself, I won't sell cars. I mean, they are selling your private information to other people. Finally, they have a very relaxed attitude toward taxes and their obligations. And I don't know if I'll have time to get to that, so I'm going to leave it for last. Let me start with competition. The notion that regulation can work in these industries is slightly bizarre. You can see that what you're asking these people to do is to destroy their basic business model if you want them to self-regulate. The incentive to gather as much personal data as they can, especially Facebook, and sell these data to advertisers is overwhelming. I mean, that's their business model. Regulations that attempt to leave that incentive in place and somehow control that in a market where there are few alternative equivalent services, they're doomed to fail. The profit margin in the trade they're doing, that is, we'll give you free use of the platform, you give us your information. The profit margin on that trade is enormous. And there's no way that you can either make a fine big enough to make them behave with that or think of a regulation that will stop it. Now, there was a brief moment of light when Sheryl Sandberg was testifying before Congress when she said, well, we're considering maybe a solution of having you as an alternative to giving us your data to pay cash for the use of our platform. But that disappeared pretty quickly when all those people sitting behind her handed her a flurry of notes. They're not going to do that. There's no way that you can, even if you could do that, it'd be very, very difficult to set the price for the use of that platform. Now, the root of the platform, the root of the problem, is that if you don't like it, you don't have any place to go. Now, you could say, well, do without it. But like it or not, it's come to be, in a lot of uses, a necessity, seen a necessity. Now, again, I warn you about one thing, that over time, almost any monopoly can be overcome. Chris DeMuth, who is much more distinguished than I am in this whole regulation field, used to argue with me that electric transmission is not a monopoly, that somehow, eventually, and I'm sure he's right, and when eventually comes, I hope he will stand at my grave and send a little note and say, eventually has come, there's now transmission competition. But basically, there's a long, long period of earning monopoly profits before you get to it. Now, I understand there's something coming along called TikTok, which I don't know, but in 2018, more people signed up for it than for Instagram. So maybe I'm wrong on this, and maybe it is possible, but right now there's a very strong monopoly position. Now, the solution to that, in my judgment, is to create alternatives by reversing an enormous public policy error that the FTC has made in recent years. Mr. Zuckerberg has made 66 acquisitions in recent years, including Instagram, what's not, or whatever it's called, that might evolve into competitors if left alone. They brought up tiny entrants that might morph into competitors. He's bought out the guy in the garage who was willing to sell out in an early phase, and there were no antitrust implications for him of making 66 acquisitions for a dominant firm. That's pretty handy stuff. Now, you don't need a new policy here. You need to, authorities have long had the authority to prevent mergers that substantially lessen competition and to order divestiture as a remedy for mergers that prove to have done that. I saw somebody walking, you were walking around with this new book, Zucked, as it's called. And he says, and he has a substantial interest in Facebook, the three internet platforms, Amazon, Google, and Facebook, have benefited enormously from the Chicago School's antitrust philosophy, which is essentially not to do very much, with all due respects to my former colleague, Bob Bork. It's hardly beyond the interpretive skills of lawyers to find a way of dealing with this problem in terms that are not developed in connection with oil companies and steel companies. So I think that, which you total up market shares and you say U.S. Steel had this much or Standard Oil had that much, that won't do it in this. And I think what you need is a more imaginative application of existing antitrust laws. As a practical matter, since it's difficult to identify potential competitors of Facebook, I do believe what they have to do is a very simple thing. Simply say no more acquisitions, period. We're not going to mess with this. You made 66. You got a dominant market share. There will be no more acquisitions for Facebook. Now, there are two objections to that, which I want to put before you, and you may find them compelling. One is that it deprives possible entrants the money they could get for selling out. I mean, there's this poor guy, he worked in a garage, he's got this thing, Zuckerberg is scared to death of it. He looks in his petty cash drawer and says, well, $3 billion should do it. I'll buy this guy out. And I'm saying you shouldn't let him do that. Now, that guy's going to be very angry. And I think you got here a balance of public rights, That guy has a right to sell his stuff, but I'm saying he can't because of the effect on competition. So worry about that. And the second is more substantive. Markets generally do a better job than regulators, with all respect, Harold. Facebook is developing what they call a clear history option, which would give users, they say, an easy path to reclaiming ownership of their personal data. I don't believe that will happen because that would destroy the business model. But they will have something called a clear option next year, and I think we have to see what it turns out to be. If it turns out to be really something that would threaten their market power, then I would want to think again about a overall ban on further acquisitions. But basically, I see no alternative except to stop the merger wave that is eating up competition for Facebook. And there are even precedents now, for requiring Facebook to help these people get started. There's a case called Aspen Ski in which I was involved. You can look it up if you like. But I do think we have to find some competitive alternative. Now, I don't want you to go away thinking that the existing tools only apply to Facebook. There's Google. It does have market power in search. It won that market power, I think, fair and square. It's a very, very powerful engine that it has. But that doesn't mean that it should be allowed to use that to dominate other markets in which it is not the most efficient provider, maps and all that other stuff, which it can do. And you can have regulators fining it, which is going on in Europe, or you can have them trying to figure out how you jiggle all of the equations that Google uses to get itself up where it wants to when you start looking for a map. But I think that is a feckless chore. And what we should do is split Google up into two companies. One is the dominant search engine, which it should make as much money as it wants, and the other having the ancillary services, which, if they are really good, should do fine in competition with competitive providers. But you would remove from the scene Google's ability to extend its market power from search into these other markets. Amazon is a little more difficult case. I mean, it operates in highly competitive markets. It has something like, I think, 5% of total retail sales. It's not dominant in most of those markets, although it is dominant in some. But it's been an enormous source of innovation and driving down margins and introducing competition. It does do one thing that traditional antitrust policy can get at, and that's called pre-announcements by a major dominant firm. You're something called, I think, Blue Kitchen or something. Those of you who cook, they deliver you these fresh ingredients. Is that what it is? And then you do things to them? Blue Apron. Thank you very much. Well, we have 1, 2, 3 cooks, chef, with us. The Blue Apron. Blue Apron delivers this stuff, and you cook it up, and your family loves you, and it's all wonderful stuff. And then they need capital, so they announce an IPO. Well, at that point, Amazon announces that they're going into that business of sending these kits, and suddenly the market price and the value of the IPO plummets. IBM used to do that in the days when it dominated the computer, remember those big computers that you now carry in your pocket, industry, and the antitrust authorities didn't like it. And there might be something to be said when Amazon announces something, whether it ends up doing it or not, or whether it just does it a little, it hammers the competition. I mean, Amazon says, well, we're going to open a couple of grocery stores, and suddenly the cost of capital of all grocery stores goes up. Now, I think we ought to be very careful because we want that to happen if it's a legitimate entry. But if it is not, we don't want it to happen. And that's one place I would look at Amazon, because right now Amazon is doing something I think quite phenomenal. The problem in all, well, Harold will know this better than I, but it's the so-called last mile problem with a lot of our competitors. How do you get from your new cable, from anything, to the door of the customer? And now Amazon is integrating forward into that last mile, and I think that's a pretty good thing. It's competing with UPS, FedEx, and the dominant force in that industry, the U.S. Post Office, famed worldwide for its efficiency. Let's switch from monopoly power to content control of the hackers, the false newspaper, the violent, the abusive, who use the Facebook platform. I think that we face here a rather simple problem in which the existing tools are available. The internet companies have gotten themselves Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act of 1996, which exempts them from all the liability that print newspapers, magazines, etc., to which those are subject. Now, picture a newspaper editor who publishes any piece of trash that comes in the mail, and that results in violence, or it results in destroying somebody's reputation, or he's liable. And as one who consulted with a lot of tabloids in Britain, I can tell you that that liability is very substantial, and it keeps people on their toes, and it makes them careful what they print. The internet companies don't have any liability for that, and so they claim they are erecting various protections that substitute for that liability, and they just don't. I mean, you saw Zuckerberg professing no knowledge of things. I never heard of that. Well, we're going to fix it. The thing he never heard of, he's in the process of fixing. We're going to have 20,000 people going through, looking at it. Now, do you know if it only takes 20? Maybe it takes 50,000. I don't know. But if you restored liability, just treat them. And the notion that, by the way, we're just a platform. We don't control content. That would be like a publisher of the Washington Post saying, I just have printing presses. I don't control what they print. He has a platform. He does control content. He is a publisher and should be subject to, and I really believe that creating that sort of liability. Now, I understand all about class action lawyers, and I understand all about the evils of the lawyers who are supposed to be bringing down the legal system by representing plaintiffs. But the fact, and they will be oversuing, there's no question about that. But compared to leaving to an unregulated platform, determining its own, making its own decisions, not subject to liability as to what it produces, I think is unwise. And so I think all we have to do is repeal Section 230 of the Communication. All we have to do. I mean, I don't know how hard that is to do in the face of the lobbying efforts, but I do think that would correct some of the problem that we're having with content. Francis Fukuyama, who just wrote a very interesting piece in The American Interest, which is also a very interesting publication, says the idea that big internet platforms are not media companies has never really been tenable, and it isn't. So again, I think if we have an existing solution, a traditional hoary, spelled H-O-A-R-Y, solution to the problem, we really ought to use it. Now, there are First Amendment problems, there are all sorts of problems, but this has worked. I mean, we do have, let's put it, how can I put it? Oh, I know. Why don't we say that we want to subject Facebook to the standards of decency and propriety to which we, well, what can I think of? Supermarket tabloids, okay, to which we subject supermarket tabloids, of which Mr. Bezos has now become aware. So So I've solved that problem. Let me spend a minute, though, on taxes. I think I have time to do that. No company has an obligation to pay more in tax than it's legally obliged to do. The very wealthy people who are running around the country saying they are undertaxed always amuse me. I mean, they have a solution to that problem. It's very easy. You write a check for what you think you really should pay, and you mail it to the Treasury, and that's it. Then you don't have to feel guilty anymore and run around the country asking to be taxed for more. But the problem for Facebook, for Google, for Amazon, to mention just those, is that there is no way to tax their profits that is feasible. Intellectual property is intangible. You can put it in Dublin. You can put it in the Bahamas. You can fight about the value of it. You can fight about the value of the brand Starbucks. And you're going to lose, because I think Chris DeMuth made this point, this wonderful book by Goodhart about the anywheres and the everywhere, the somewheres and the anywheres, whatever. But these are anywhere companies. These are international companies. They do not feel particular obligations to the domiciles in which they reside. And they do have a fiduciary obligation to legally reduce their tax burden. That's their obligation to their shareholders. So I think, I hate to say this in the Hudson Institute, but Barack Obama was on to something. Let me finish the whole sentence before you call Ken Weinstein and say, well, who are you booking here? When he said, you didn't build that. Now, he just didn't finish the sentence. The sentence should be, without drawing on government and societal resources, most notably education. But he said it shorthand, and politics being what they are. So the solution is, again, it seems to me not, and I've been over this in Europe and other places. The solution, it seems to me, is to tax gross sales. You're never going to tax profits. Going after their profits reminds me of the poor greyhounds who are chasing the mechanical rabbit. And the mechanical rabbit is these companies. You're never going to catch up with them. They're better at it than the government people. There are more of them. They're smarter. The smart government people are hoping they get hired by these guys someday. So you've got to give it up. You can't do it. But you can tax sales. I mean, that's, it seems to me, the solution. If they sell it in America, you pay a tax on it. If they sell it and that's sort of what is going on now voluntarily, close to voluntarily. There's some social pressure with Starbucks in Britain. They are voluntarily paying more than their computed legal taxes. And I think it's part because they were threatened with a tax on sales. So again, it's not magic. It's not magic. There are things that enable us to get this under control. Now, I'm no expert on this in this town on lobbying and who gets what done for them, but it seems to me that there's pretty clear guidelines. Now, let me offer three thoughts about this whole situation in which we find ourselves, and then I would love to have questions, because the things I've just said, I don't want to imply that anybody else agrees with in Hudson. I speak only for myself, which has been my fate in life for a long time, so I don't really worry about it. But I'm not binding the people who work on regulation here. I'm not binding the people who work on taxes here. I can't do that, and nobody should. So just please keep that in mind. I want to close with 3 thoughts. First, it's a sad fact that where America once led in devising means of preventing the use of unsavory business tactics to acquire monopoly power, that was basically we weren't against Standard Oil because Standard Oil was big. We were against Standard Oil because they had the habit of burning down other people's refineries. That's not nice. We now trail the Europeans in this. And if it's anything I hate, it's trailing the EU bureaucracy in anything because it's an incredible bureaucracy. But this they seem to have right. It reined in Microsoft. And almost crippled the company for a decade by having it concentrate on answering monopoly charges rather than innovating. Intel, with very big fines, and this move to confine Google's power, again with fines over the issue of extending it into markets other than search, if it has found, and by the way, Google denies that it has a monopoly power or dominant position, as they call it in Europe, over search. That's an issue they do not concede. They lose all the time, but they don't concede it. So they've got that pretty much under control in Europe, and we don't. Second, I should add to that, I guess, in Europe, that with their data requirements now, their regulations on the use of personal data, they've gone much further than we have in trying to rein in. I think they're not going to be able to do it, but at least they're making it very chancy and expensive if you use personal data without the consent of the person who provided that data. Now, what consists of offering consent? I don't know if any of you ever tried to get off Facebook or limit its use of your data. It's not easy. And so that's another whole area. But still, they're working on it. Now, second thought I have is that the time to correct anti-competitive abuses by Facebook is now. Now, I know everybody who gives a quasi-academic speech has to have something in it to imply urgency, because by now you've finished eating and your options have expanded. But this is an urgent matter, and it's an urgent matter because whatever else you could say about Mr. Zuckerberg, and I could say a lot, and if you read Zuck, you could say a lot, or if you just watch the clips of his performance before Congress or his decision not to appear before a parliamentary committee in London, there's a thread of arrogance through it that gets communicated. But one thing is, he's quicker than government. You can count on it. He's quicker than government. And most people are, but he's quicker than government. He's not a study in candor. He's not a study in, well, let's leave it at candor. And yet he knows what's coming in terms of regulation. You'd almost have to be tone deaf to not know that some bad thing is going to happen to your model. And that bad thing, the only bad thing that would really worry him, is breaking up his company, which was put together by merger. I mean, his two, WhatsApp and Instagram, he didn't develop WhatsApp and Instagram. WhatsApp and Instagram was somebody else, and he bought it while the FTC was taking a snooze. So he's merging all of those into one scrambled egg. And if that's not stopped, he's going to, it will be almost impossible to unscramble it. Now, the Germans, who are very sensitive to this, partly because these are American companies. There's no denying the anti-American aspect of regulation in the EU. But the Germans are trying to stop that. They're trying to enjoin his ability to mash these up into one mass that can never be separated. And if that, now there's a new FTC task force of 17 lawyers. 17 lawyers. I mean, 17 lawyers is a lot of lawyers, isn't it, for a task force?
Maybe more than that.
Oh, okay. Well, you have more experience than I do with that. And they have also a fellow who's apparently the person who understands the stuff to explain to the 17 lawyers. And they put this together to address the problem, the fact that perhaps, they think, Facebook has not adhered to the terms of its deal, of its settlements with the FTC. Now, they may, I don't know if they will, may take as their first assignment preventing this mashup so as to keep their options open if they decide that divestiture is the way to go. I'm not sure because they're under pressure now that they were not under before, but they have not been stellar performers in this area. So that's the second thought. The third thought that troubles me a lot, I have a note here. If nobody agrees with the last point, you could say, otherwise we're going to be zucked. But I'd rather not say it. Third, these companies have enormously enriched our lives. I don't think there's any question about that. Now, do I agree with what's taken to be enrichment? No. I do not believe, now, of course, I don't have any friends at all, so having friends on Facebook wouldn't do me any good. But I do not believe a friend on Facebook is an acceptable social substitute for a friend, you know, the live kind who cry with you when you hit trouble. I think that, and Amazon has certainly enrich people's lives. If you just look at the economics of it, the saving in time, shopping, it's almost as liberating for women as the washing machine and the dryer. If I remember when I first went to London, where they had only very small refrigerators, and it was assumed that women would shop every day and buy a little piece of butter and a little thing of milk, and then the next day she would go do the same thing, and it was part of the chore. Well, we got out of that. I think Amazon is contributing to the ability of women to run a household, or of men, if that's the division of labor in the house, or both, if that's what they do. I mean, Amazon now has a system whereby your necessities, your basic necessities, of which apparently I'm told Tide is the major one, you're on automatic pilot. They know when you use it up, and it appears at your door. That also saves in fuel, which should make some of the people here happier, so we can avoid the globe warming up like it is now. So that's thing. So we do want to preserve the benefits that they have brought to us. As for the social problems, that's for us to solve. I mean, nobody can deny the benefit of the iPhone. Anyone who is a prisoner of wires and AT&T in the olden days certainly can appreciate the advantage of the iPhone. Now, does it create social problems? Does it create addiction? Does it distract students from reading something called a book? I don't know. But that's our problem. That's not anything you can lay at iPhone's feet. So that's where I come out. Let me just, in conclusion, say we have the tools. You remember Winston Churchill in the early stages of World War II, when they were losing the battle to the U-boats and supplying their island, and they were standing alone fighting Britain. And his motto when he came here to sort of ask us to help him out, even though Roosevelt could not get a a vote that would have allowed us to join the war. It was give us the tools and we will use them. We have the tools right now to address any of the problems I've mentioned, and we don't want to use them. And I don't know what to do about that. So if anyone here knows more about Washington than I do, I would love to hear it. Sir, are you raising your hand or scratching your ear?
No.
Are you going to recognize the people, or should
I will recognize people.
Good.
Yes.
So you know how, no one with a hard question.
No hard questions. But yes, and we have a microphone coming, and please identify yourself, and you may ask your question.
Tom Timberg, obviously.
Speak louder.
Tom Timberg, consultant. Can everybody hear?
Yeah.
Okay. You raised a lot of very interesting ideas. A couple of things I didn't hear. You talked about a more aggressive anti-merger policy. What about restoring the concept of predatory competition? And it seems to me you almost raised that, talking about the effect of pre-announcement.
Right.
And that's another thing which the Chicago...
Well, you know, there is a problem with predation, and the reason I didn't mention it is because there's a long story about predation. As you well know, the question is, can the predator count on the profits from his predation, or will entry? I believe there is predation. I'll tell you why I believe it. If you go and you see a beautiful field, and it's got a no trespassing sign on it, right? The hell with it. I'll spread my blanket. I'll have my picnic. Now, suppose it has 2 or 3 corpses there. Then you won't. So predation doesn't consist of creating enough fear of retaliation that people don't enter. And there is a problem with entry, especially for industries that need capital from venture capitalists. Venture capitalists get scared away. I've been at meetings where some newcomer comes in and he has this great idea. And in those days, the first question was, what will Microsoft do? In other words, what will be the counter? I'm sure there's meetings now where people come in and are asked, well, what will Amazon do? Or what will Facebook do? and like the example I gave, was it Blue Apron again? Blue Apron, that's what they will do. And I think that has to be stopped. So, but the problem of stopping it means you're going to give up some innovation. It's going to get lost in the process. And these are trade-offs. Economics is a series of trade-offs. You don't like deficits? Good. Tell me what you don't want spent on. Military entitlements? What? It's trade-offs. And everything I've said has trade-offs. And it's one of the reasons we end up in shouting matches in economics is because they're true. I'm telling you that if you do what I said, you will probably give up some innovation. You will say, well, that's horrible. Well, that's a social decision. I would say, well, stifling competition is worse. So now we're down to a values argument, and those are very difficult to settle. Oh, how are you doing?
Mr. Hershey, but before,
Yeah.
I just want to do a follow-up on the question, which is more broadly on Sherman's Section 2. Do you have a view about whether the whole toolkit available under Sherman Section 2 is being used, or do there need to be changes there? Not just predation, but tying arrangements, refusal to deal,
Yeah.
types of things.
All of that stuff. I mean, I'm very nervous about it. I know that I'm not supposed to be, but Sherman Section 2, Sherman Section 2, which is essentially the anti-monopoly section, let's call it, whereas Section 1, you can call as the monopolization section. Sherman Section 2 had its base in 2 things. One is that competition is a good thing and monopoly is a bad thing. Okay. The other is that the accretion of economic power has antisocial consequences. If you read the the history of the Sherman Act, if you read the legislative history of the Sherman Act, there's no question that the senators, and I think Senator Sherman, was he the son of the Sherman who burned the South? I think so. There's no question that people were concerned. We went through this when the supermarkets came. Everybody said, we got to preserve the corner grocery. We didn't. And we're okay. There's still corner groceries and there's plenty of supermarkets. So it would have been wrong to worry about the social consequences. It's like the social consequences of bookstores. I remember when Amazon first started selling books, the conservatives, well, intellectuals on campus, when they used to be intellectuals on campus, would say, where will I find Shakespeare? Well, you find him on Amazon if you want to, and there's still plenty of bookstores. So the problem is we worried about, at that time, we worried about that economic power was followed by political power. That's now a revived concern. So the answer to your question is I don't know. That's a clear, specific answer.
Mr. Hershey.
I'm Bob Hershey. I'm a consultant. I applaud your citing the question of trade-offs, and I would say they're more on the other side, that I think there's a lot more to lose of not having the innovation and new things being developed. Like in the old days, Bell Labs had a laboratory under AT&T, which is now gone, and that's the kind of thing we have to lose, as opposed to worrying too much about the other firms that are trying to get there. And if they do very well, the public will honor them with their business, or the incumbent company might buy them out. And I'd say at the gathering, the first question will not be, it'll be, what about the government? What are they going to do? And if you have these open to government interpretation, often after the fact, that it's a worse situation than if you let the market have its play.
Well, let me ask you, let's use the Bell Labs example. I mean, that's the one you want to have. I was a consultant to AT&T at the time of the breakup. Okay. And I had been touring Bell Labs, and it was an enormously impressive place. No question. I remember there was some guy sitting staring at the ceiling, and I said to his boss, what's he do? How do you know he's working? He said, I think he invented the transistor. So I remember all of that. Now, think a little more broadly. Do you think the telecommunications industry is less able to serve the public since AT&T was broken up than before? You do. Well, I don't. Okay, I'm glad I'm free of the wires. I remember coming back to Bell Labs from Europe with a decorated telephone. It was really gorgeous. And I said, why don't you guys make that? And we went to Western Electric, because they were very sensitive to any criticism. We went to Western Electric, and they sort of looked at it, and they sniffed a little bit. And they said, well, but look at this. Our phones are going to last 75 years. This phone will never last 75 years. I said, people don't have their grandparents' furniture anymore. Why can't you make one of these with, they didn't like the screws. They didn't have to. The answer is we don't have to. They did not have to innovate. The pace of introduction of innovation was very slow. Now, there were massive innovators that come from Bell Labs, but if you believe that the day of the 75-year-old black dial telephone, remember, without direct dial for a long time, without direct long-distance dialing, at rates that you sometimes had a timer when you were on, you're not as old as I am, but there were timers for when you were talking long distance. And I remember in my office, one of the Bell executives said, what is that on your phone? And I said, that's a shoulder rest. You know, remember? Use the cradle phone. He said, that's a foreign attachment. I said, what do you mean it's a foreign attachment? He said, you're not allowed to attach anything to our system. I said, it's not attached to your system, it's attached to the telephone. Yeah, but it's our telephone, he said. Well, I didn't take it off, and they didn't fire me. But try to get an answering machine put on your telephone in those days, and you would get a lawsuit. So I don't think, let's put it this way, we all have our own memories of the past, right? Mine is that was a much more restrictive environment of innovation, too, including Bell Labs, for which I had great respect, than the situation we have now. So I will respectfully, and very respectfully, disagree.
I have a question over here.
Yes, I'm Chris Bladowski from Manufacturers Alliance for Productivity and Innovation.
I couldn't hear where you're from.
Manufacturers Alliance for Productivity and Innovation. And it's been a while since I took industrial organization in graduate school, so I may be on shaky ground.
Anymore, do they?
I may be on shaky ground. Treat it as a devil's advocate question.
Sure.
You said break up Google because the high rents they generate on the quasi-monopoly position in the search market, they plow into a competitive marketplace that they can then possibly turn into a less competitive marketplace. Is that more or less what you advocate?
No, I didn't say that. I'll play with that question too if you want, but what I did say was that they can manipulate their search engine to give precedence to their own products over products that may well be better products and may not be. We won't know unless they could compete in an open market.
But why would you then break up Google? What's the purpose?
Because what I would do is the search engine then would not have a reason to give precedence to any, let's stick with maps, it's the easiest one, to any mapping operation to jiggle the search engine so that comes up first. Once you get to the second page of a search, you're in trouble. They now have an enormous incentive to favor their own products on their search engine, and I would simply take that away. It wouldn't hurt the shareholders. The shareholders would get a very viable company, and if the Google product is better or would be under pressure to become better, they would also be enriched. So I'm not saying that they take profits from one and they subsidize it. I'm saying they create a non-level playing field for competitors of their other products.
Of the other, okay. Then I misunderstood the question. Then I thought that you meant to break up Google for the simple reason that the other areas in which they innovate, for example, artificial intelligence or whatnot, would then suffer from lack of funds. That would have been my argument that stifles innovation. But in this case, I misunderstood your question. Okay.
You can relax for the rest of the afternoon.
Oh, that makes me much happier now. Thanks.
Next question. This gentleman here.
My name is Sam Miranda. I don't have an affiliation. I'm a retired nuclear engineer. I guess I'll call myself a consultant. Anyway, one of the things I did was write regulations and enforce them. And you were talking about regulations, and we have lots of regulations. Why not use them? And I was thinking that we have a situation today, I would call it an extension of monopoly, wherein industry, for example, big pharma, or electric utilities, what I'm familiar with, that operate nuclear plants, have captured their regulatory agencies, and they're in charge now. So could you say something about the antitrust implications of that and of those monopolies?
Yeah, regulatory capture, of course, is always a major problem, which is why we prefer to avoid it by having competition, because then you don't need the regulation. But in my experience, until what I consider relatively recently, and some of you younger people probably consider old history, the antitrust division was pretty immune from regulatory capture. It would be, again, in my experience, it would be useless for the senator from the state of Washington to send a letter, and it was useless, to send a letter to the antitrust division to back off on its Microsoft case. It would be counterproductive in the extreme, and people wouldn't do it. So I have more faith in the ability of, let's just think about the antitrust division, which has had really distinguished leaders until relatively recently, that I don't worry about it there, or I didn't. Now, other agencies, I'm pretty familiar with, some, including the ones you're talking about. The electric utilities, for one, are experts at regulatory capture. I mean, and they were so experts at it, at least in New York State, that they almost went to jail capturing regulators with favors and so on. And then a friend of mine became chairman and cleaned it all up. But those are very much in danger of regulatory capture. Now, the FTC, I don't know. Okay, I find it very difficult to explain this period of just watching an industry. I mean, 66 mergers is a lot not to take a look at. I don't believe they're corrupt. I don't believe in the traditional sense. You know, here's a bag of money, don't sue me. I don't believe that at all. I think that I worry about that. I worry also, however, about the adverse of that. I mean, if you take the EPA, for example, Environmental Protection Agency, which wrote regulations about what constitutes the danger created by a puddle of water basing on something that regulates the Atlantic Ocean, you worry about regulation run wild. There's a wonderful piece about that in the Wall Street Journal by Chris DeMuth just, 2 days ago, in which he discusses this problem of legislators refusing to be specific in the laws they pass and just let the regulators do whatever they want. I remember John Dingell, who I much admired and disagreed with a lot, but I mean, he always complained that it would be hard getting something out of the committee that was specific, rather than just says, well, we want clean air or something, and then leave it to the regulators to write the rules, which really should be legislation. So there's two problems with it. And I'm very reluctant to turn something over to regulators. That's why you notice that I've said in the case of Facebook, Zuckerberg would love regulation. It's a game he's going to win. There's no way a regulator can do it. Or in taxes. They would love having anything except they don't mind having taxes on profits because they're going to win that game. That's why I prefer competition. And that's why I would go to great lengths and take risks to establish competition, because regulation, what does regulation result in? Well, in Europe, where it's hefty fines. Okay, hefty, well, it could be some multiple of your annual turnover. Yeah, so it takes you a couple of years to make it back. Meanwhile, you litigate, and you could stall that off for a long time. So I hope that one of the things I've made clear is that to the extent that we can establish competition, alternatives to Facebook, where people can say, gee, I don't like what he's doing with my data. I don't really want anyone to know what my menstrual cycle is. And then go somewhere else, we're going to be much better off than trying to get Zuckerberg to be a good guy, because he won't. Because he thinks he is. Remember, the whole world will be knit together. And the way he will do that is by selling your stuff so that he can subsidize Facebook in Zimbabwe. It's a nice idea, but he's not a government. He's a person. And no one should have that power. And I don't think this is telling tales out of school, but yes, it is. Well, no, it isn't. Jeff Bezos has admitted that he has too much power. Now, is he asking for regulation? I don't know. And he certainly found something in New York about the limits of power. When you think the governor has enough power to say yes, and some city councilman who you never heard of can say no. I mean, you really got to misunderstand New York politics to get himself in the bind he got into. But I do think that let's say we did everything here that I just said. I don't think we need significant regulation. So I'm on your side about regulatory capture. I certainly, in the nuclear industry, you certainly saw it in spades.
Final question goes to Tom Duesterberg.
Oh, my goodness. Hi.
Howdy.
Long time no see, as the bishop said. Yeah.
I wanted to pursue a little bit your comments on privacy. You noted that a lot of the critique of the Europeans on the American, on the Fangs and other technology companies revolve around their notion of privacy.
Right.
And increasingly, I think I see on the left here in the United States the same sort of critique.
Right.
Now, as we think about the future, data flows are going to be very important to things like artificial intelligence and the Internet of Things. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about how to recognize and do something about legitimate privacy concerns and not totally destroy things that are less central to privacy, like the transmission of data that will be used in the Internet of Things that's purely commercial purposes. Can one make that distinction? And do you have any thoughts on how to do it?
Tell me this. The privacy stuff in Europe, for example, let's take it with Google. You've got the right to be forgotten or something like that. You could tell Google, I don't want you have anything in your files about me anymore. It's not your business, and I'm exercising my right to be forgotten. Now, anybody thinks that's going to make people forget some of the horrors that they commit, that's wrong. But in any event, so we're not talking about that, because that's not a data transmission problem. We're talking about the right to control the use of the personal data you surrender in return for access to a platform. Is that right? Okay, now I don't see how giving someone, since you can't and won't give them the option of saying, okay, I want to use your platform, how much? But you don't get any data. Okay, that would, if we could do that, that would solve the problem, right? You could use the platform, you don't have to give them any data, you keep your data. If somebody wants to come to you and say, I'll give you a free ticket to a movie if you tell me how old you are and what your income is, that's a private transaction, and we can live with that. I fail to see how retaining control, now you could cede control if you want to. If you think, gee whiz, you know, the nice thing about giving up my privacy, my personal data is I only get ads for things I'm interested in. That's possible. I mean, I made the mistake of shopping for a camera. I wish I hadn't. But at least I'm getting ads for cameras. I don't, and that's an advantage. And you shouldn't, that shouldn't be taken away from you unless you want it to be. So tell me, can you give me a specific example of how it would interfere with the flow of data relevant to innovations, let's say, in artificial intelligence?
Well,
and I ask only because I have so great respect for the work
I don't fully understand this, but in thinking about trade in the future, the Chinese, for instance, will they will cause you to localize your data and not be able to transmit that over across the country line. So they grab all of the data that's available.
Right.
That's valuable for developing artificial intelligence. So the Europeans, in their latest trade agreement, which was with Japan, and I'm sorry to get technical here, but they refused what the U.S. did in the North American Free Trade Agreement, which is more or less require no limits on data transmission across national borders, and no localization of data. Now, that's important for commercial purposes. Again, the Internet of Things. I'm just wondering if one can disentangle that from transmission of personal data, because we're going to be using the same communication systems.
The answer is I don't know the answer to that, but it seems to me that, first of all, there's nothing we can do about countries like China or Russia who want to control what comes in, what goes out. I mean, countries can do that, not with 100% effectiveness, but they can do it. I'm trying to think. The answer is I don't know whether you can separate. The answer, I guess, the more I think about it, the more I'm convinced I don't know. So I'll just have to think about it. And if you have anything on it, Thomas, send it to me. Oh, shucks.
And with that, please join me in thanking Dr. Stelzer.
Thank you very much. That was pretty good.
It's great. Well done.